This is CUDAN Open Lab Seminar, the second session in spring 2023. It's February 13, and it's our greatest pleasure today to have guests from the Urban Complexity Lab as the University of Applied Sciences at Potsdam. That's FH Potsdam. And we have in particular Boris Müller and Ilias Kyriazis. I just tweeted at all because there may be other people. This is a lab encounter. Our typical procedure is a 2-hour session where if it's a talk, it's 40-minute talk and 80 minutes discussion. If it's a lab encounter, this can be all sorts of different forms depending on what you like to do. But in general, our guests have sort of the authority to do whatever they want with the 2 hours. You can take a question in between, you can take questions at the end. We can wander away from your topic, we can stick with topic, depending on what your intention is, basically. And so basically the stage is yours. I encourage you to sort of like introduce yourself, maybe. And yeah, you should be able to share the screen, and we are all ears and very much looking forward to all the awesome work you're doing.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. It's really fun to do these. I like these kind of smallish encounter events where you kind of meet colleagues from all over the world. Yeah, we just do a quick introduction. Maybe Ilias, you want to start?
Yeah, very briefly, actually, I'm actually the newest member, I would say, I think, of the UCLAB. I'm just here since October, and I'm working for a project. It's called Restaging Fashion, but I'm going to talk about this later anyway. And yeah, I'm coming mostly from the background of cultural data, and I've worked in digital projects that regard libraries and museums. And now I'm also in a similar project in the lab. And Boris can talk now about himself.
Yeah, my name is Boris Müller. I co-direct the Urban Complexity Lab together with my colleague Marianne Dirk. And maybe just to give you a little bit of background information about us, the lab is situated at the Fachhochschule Potsdam, University of Applied Sciences here in Potsdam. We have a design department which had just its 30th birthday. And this year we have the 20th birthday of a special degree, namely the interface design program that we run here. So in the design department, we have 3 different design directions. We have communication design, product design, and interface design, and we have also European media studies. So we're a fairly large team here at the university. And one of the things about and I'm a professor in the interface design program. I'm now here also for 20 years. And we always had a very strong interest in doing research. And so we've initiated 2 different research labs here at our university. One is the Interaction Design Lab, run by Constanze Langer and Frank Heidmann mainly, and the other one is the Urban Complexity Lab that Marianne and I am running. So yeah, that's the general setting. So it's very design driven. I can already say that. And what we have in mind today is first I would like to give you speed presentations of projects that we finished. Then Ilias will talk a little bit more at length about an ongoing project, the Restaging Fashion, where you can also learn a little bit or see a little bit about the process, the way we work. And at the very end, because we have 2 hours and because I'm a professor, I would like to do a little bit of theory, and I would like to talk about the culturality of data visualizations, because this is something that we also talk about a lot in the lab, but which is not something that I find is it's a very prominent topic in the database community. So I would like to introduce a few ideas, a few concepts, and then maybe we can take it from there. Yeah, is there anything you need to know, or that you have any questions before I start?
That sounds awesome.
Okay. Then let's start. Whiteboard. Oh, I have a whiteboard. Hold on a second. I'm struggling with, I should not struggle with Zoom, but I am. Hold on a second.
We've all been there in the last weeks.
I can't see my desktop. It's only. Did you use a special setting where you can only share windows but not my desktop?
No. We can make you co-host, and you should have maybe even more privileges. Let me do this.
Yeah, actually, that would be good.
Does that work?
Okay. That's very odd. I only see windows, but not my second screen, because I have a second screen here and I would like to run my presentation on the second screen.
I had that too. So maybe you need to move the Zoom window to that other screen. That may be an issue, which is, I think it's a Zoom issue, not a configuration.
Yes, you're probably right, because it's in full screen already. Hold on. And then if I do this now, no, same problem. That's weird. I have that for a long time. No, that's fine.
According to our settings, you should be able to share screen, chat, rename yourself, start video, and share whiteboard. So,
okay, let me try one thing, and then if that doesn't work, I'll just start. That's super odd. Hold on. It's not. Okay, I think I've found a workaround.
nice.
All right, here we go.
Awesome.
Okay, yeah. Again, this is all the stuff I think I've said already. So let's go straight into the slides. This is a beautiful setting here in Potsdam, and I always kind of like to show screenshots from Google Earth. What you see in the middle, this kind of green L-shaped building, this is us. This is the design department. The complexity lab is next to the cafeteria, which is sometimes convenient. And I always like to show these kind of images because the point I'm trying to make here is that data visualizations have really become part of our visual life. I think most people would never assume that they're confronted here, or would never expect that this is a kind of data visualization. I would just say, well, it's just a 3D simulation of an environment. It's just Google Maps. But I find it very interesting that we're dealing here with images, and these images are also enriched with information. And it's geographical information, it's contextual information. You have street names, you see things about traffic, you see kind of the tram stop here in front of a building. You can see kind of, where you get food and drinks and so on and so on. So I think the point I want to make here is that data visualization is a very, very kind of prominent part of our visual culture these days. And sometimes it's really interesting to reflect on that because we just take it for granted, but in a way, I don't think it is. And yeah, very quickly here, here's the team. This is not the most recent photo, but you can see it's a fairly big bunch. We have a number of different research projects running in the team. The guy with the green jacket is Marian. That's my direct colleague. And Marian always wears a green jacket for some reason. And here we do a little lab excursion. So it's a fairly big team. I don't know how many projects we have right now, but it's quite a few. And what I would like to do in the beginning is to give you a rough idea of what we're working on the kind of diverse types of projects we're working on. And I'd like to start with the project that was finished in 2020. It was a 3-year EU project called Census. It was a fairly big team from all over Europe. The Wageningen University was there, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, Stockholm Institute, Environment Institute, the IASA in Vienna, and us. So it was fairly large. And the whole topic of this project were climate change scenarios. And this is a graphic, this is a visualization that you would find in an IPCC report, specifically here in the 5th assessment report. And what this graphic tries to communicate are different pathways for kind of the future climate, how the future climate will evolve. And I don't want to dig too deeply into this graphic. My point is simply here that we can see here there is a real need for better climate scenario communication. This is a very, very complicated graphic, and it's fairly hard to understand. And I don't think this is kind of a useful way to talk about climate change scenarios for the general public. So our job in this project was to really take this very, very complex data visualizations from the scientists, from the climate scientists, and turn them into something that's more accessible, more understandable, that can be used by different, very diverse bunch of stakeholders. So the first thing we did was really, we tried to simplify things, and we tried to explain things. So what is a projection? What is a pathway? How different are different pathways, and how can we talk about the future, and how can we talk about possible climate futures? So it was very much about visual literacy, and we wanted to explain kind of how these not only graphs work, but how climate scenarios work. We also talked a little bit, also quite a lot actually, about the intricacies of dealing with climate change. And for example, this is a very simple graphic that we came up with, but it was a result, I think, of a 5-hour workshop with climate scientists, because what we try to really show is how different aspects of climate change are directly related to different strategies. And just not going to do that here now. And for example, here, if we add another layer here of information to it, you can see the right-hand side deals with the mitigation of climate change, while the left-hand side deals with the adaptation of climate change. Mitigation and adaptation are the two main strategies in fighting climate change. I don't want to go into all the details, but you can see it's really very much about simplifying a lot. But we only simplified a lot. We also came up with very, very complex visual tools that explain a bit more in detail how climate change scenarios work. And if you're curious, we came up with a website, Climate Change Scenarios, where we present a number of tools that visualize different scenarios. And for example, here's one screenshot from the phasing out fossil fuels learn module, and it's a visualization of uncertainty trends in fossil fuel volumes. So how much different kinds of fossil fuels will probably be used in different scenarios in the next 80 years. Or the last visualization I want to show very quickly, it's a bit more understandable, a bit more accessible. We looked at impact data, and there are very, very good scenarios out there that allow you to see where we can expect the highest amount of climate change impacts in the next few years. For example, here, heat waves is currently selected, but you can change kind of the type of impact to crop failure. And for example, you can directly see here that north of India will very, very likely be heavily impacted by climate change in the next 50 years. So yeah, this is kind of the work we did in Census. And I also would like to show very quickly another project, which is a bit more cultural and also a bit more, let's say, less tense than Census. And that's the project Coins. We collaborate a lot with cultural institutions, with cultural collections. And this was a really fun collaboration with a museum in Berlin, and explicitly with the numismatic collection of a large museum in Berlin. Numismatic, so it's a collection of coins. And as you can see here in this photo, that storing coins and making coins accessible for the public is really tricky, because coins are really small, they're sometimes really valuable, and they have hundreds and thousands of different coins, and they can only show a couple of few, and then they're very, very small. And it's not the most popular part of the museum, and the guys from the numismatic collector are always a bit sad about that. So we try to come up with a really fun and entertaining way to visualize this collection. It's all web prototype, so after the talk you can try it out. The link is also on our website. So our basic idea was, as you can already see, for the visualization was that maybe the intern or somebody by accident dropped all the coins that the museum has on the floor. So you have a huge pile of coins, and it just lies here on a huge stack. But you can already see kind of every coin is a separate item. So you can kind of scroll over it and you see directly what's on the coin itself. Now you can grab every coin. It's an object, and you could, for example, say, well, I would like to make a stack of all the golden coins in this collection. But we're on a computer, and obviously we can automate that. And we can just say, just show me all the golden coins, all the silver coins, and so on. And immediately kind of the whole collection redistributes itself. And so we now have different stacks for bronze, for silver, for gold, for electrum, for different kinds of materials. So the whole idea here is that the coins itself become part of the visualization, and there are still, little entities, so you can still drag them out. You can get further information about a single coin, for example, this one here from Greece. You can find out from which region it is, how heavy it is, what its value is, and so on. And obviously you can change the indicators. You can, for example, say, show me all the coins by minting place. So you can see that the most coins from the collection come from Rome, or another stack is from Berlin. This is from Breslau. So it's a different way to look at coins. And we also have by diameter, then they get kind of sorted how big they are. But you can also add a second indicator. So you could, for example, say, okay, I would like to have a second property and see how the coins can be sorted then. So this is a screencast, and I hope that this happens now. This is exactly by grid, so you can change the layout. And maybe I can just I think I just let it run. So you can see kind of the amount of coins here. I would like to go back to the grid. Here we go. So now you can add a second indicator, for example, say on the y-axis, I would like to have the minting place, and on the x-axis, you would like to have the radius of the coin. So I think the whole point here is it's a very, very playful interaction with the collection. And we took a kind of dry topic like coins from the last 2,500 years. And we created a visualization which is very, very playful, but which gives you all the information you want to have about these coins. And I think it's also very, very important to point out that the way we treat data visualization, as you can see here, it's not just a problem of visualization, but it's also really a problem of interface design. So the question is always kind of how can we find the right interfaces for these kinds of contents and information. And how we do that in the project itself is something that Ilias will now talk a little bit about.
Exactly. I will continue the discussion and talk a little about the project that we're working in my team. The project is called Restaging Fashion. Basically, we are 3 active members and under the supervision of Marian. You see here 5 names because Linda Freiberg has left the project and now I am in her position, but it's an interdisciplinary project. And I'm gonna take you through the different steps and see how this interdisciplinarity works. You can go to the next slide, please. Some information about the project. Basically, we stay in the cultural sector. Our collection in this case is the so-called Franz und Frieda von Lipperheide collection. It's a collection of paintings, of prints and drawings that basically depict fashion. This collection comes from the costume library in the State Museums in Berlin. Basically, we have different types of objects, and we have three different research areas that are connected. We have art history. This is my colleague Sabine de Günther. She's a curator for fashion history. Then I bring, along with Linda, we bring the information science perspective, and we have the colleague Giacomo Nani, who is focuses on the design, so on the visualization part itself, and computer science is helping also with some data cleaning. And we can go to the next slide. And basically, that's the same idea as we had with the coin collection or with the other collections that we visualize in the lab. We're going beyond the established norm of just seeing collections of museums and libraries as just a set of digital objects and images, but basically we see the items themselves as data, because this helps us think more in terms of relationships between the objects. We try to experiment with all this data we have, and if possible to reveal any hidden patterns that exist between all these different objects that maybe just by going to a regular digital collection of a museum, maybe we wouldn't be able to see those patterns. We'll go to the next slide. And so as I'm talking about data, one aspect of our work is, of course, the curation of it and establishing some representation, some knowledge representation about the whole collection. This work falls mostly within my responsibility. And we're trying to create a model where we are gonna connect the different properties that describe all these paintings, drawings, prints, everything that depicts the fashion from the 15th to the 19th century. As it started, the project started 3 years ago. Back then it was decided to start with, to use the model of CDOC CRM. I guess it's known to you for the people who use, who are dealing with cultural data. And along the way, we have seen that we need also to incorporate some other properties and descriptions that come from other models. So basically, we are creating a so-called application profile, and we're trying to gather metadata from different schemas. But in any case, we target for the best quality possible. We want to have consistency in the way we describe our objects, to be precise and complete, but at the same time also keep some level of simplicity, because the end result should be a visualization that will make this collection accessible for our end users. And that's why having good data curation is always the first step for having a good visualization. We're going to go to the next slide. And as I said, there are some patterns actually behind the data, behind its collection. And this is, there are some stories, as we can say, that are hidden in this data. And this is the work that Sabine de Günther has done. So the curator of this collection, she's trying to collect some stories that reveal the relationship between the different objects. And here, for example, we have the idea of orient or otherness. So how, for example, there are paintings and drawings that show how cultures away from the Western civilization, how they were depicted from the 15th to the 19th century. And if we go also to the next slide, we're gonna see how different relationships can be established as a first step, as we are doing our first sketches. And we can see relationships between items and original prints maybe, and then the reproductions. We can see how some of these are documented in textual sources, but we also can have some clustering of the different items. Here, for example, we see depictions of Indians, then of Turks, of Venetians. So we have different groups, and we're able to create these classes first on this very simple Miro board, for example, and then we are starting developing our way about how we can visualize this collection. We can go to the next slide, please. And it's also a first prototype that my colleague Jacobo has been developing. So basically, I have to say that our focus in our visualization is narration and storytelling. So we don't want to just have a graph representation that will show the relationship between the items, but we also want to incorporate linear narration, having some kind of an online exhibition so that the end user would be able to be informed about the collection or some specific items and their history, and at the same time to be able to see, to get some references to specific items and how they relate to each other. For example, here we have a painting that shows the 5 senses. They're basically 5 siblings, but each member of the family represents a sense. And basically, if you click on one of those, then you would be able to see the senses. And then starting from each sense, then you can go to another textual source, to another narration maybe, or other items that are related. And that's why I saw that there is this mutual relationship between narration and knowledge graphs, because you can go from one stage to the other and then back to the text. And if we go to the next slide, you can see even more specifically that starting from one specific item, as I said, maybe we want to focus on the senses, but then maybe there are other areas that are represented in the metadata of a painting. Then maybe it's going to be male fashion, maybe it's art history in general, or fashion history in general, or how families are depicted, and who relate to other items. And
sorry.
Ilias, dates refer also to date and
Ilias, you were frozen for like 10 seconds. Maybe you can repeat the last 2-3 sentences or something.
Oh, okay. I hope now you hear me now well, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just saying that based on this slide right now, we see that it's not only about the senses being represented, but starting from one painting, for example, we can also get information about male fashion, or about fashion history in general, or how families were depicted in paintings. And we establish relationships not only to items within the collections, but if we have enough information, we can also relate to items from other museums who maybe have the same focus. And this way we make use of the linked data principle, and we're trying to connect as many sources as possible. If we go to the next slide, as I said, basically storytelling is the main focus in our project. And basically we have, at least up to now, we have 3 main components that we want to use in this creation. We have the text, the narrative, and as I said, the art curator is creating stories that will help the end users make sense of the collection and its significance. Then we have, of course, the collection of medias, so the collection of images that represent the different items. And then we have knowledge graphs that show the relationships between all these entities. And we can go to the next slide, which basically shows the current level of the visualization. Actually, this is very new that my colleague Giacomo started working on this last week. The text here is in German, but still you can get the idea. So we have information. This is one of the stories. We have information about the whole collection. And as one reads the text, then some entities are highlighted, the entities in blue. And in this way, when an entity appears in the screen of the user, then automatically on the left, the graph will change its position, and then we can see that entity, its position, the position of that entity in the whole knowledge graph. And you can click in that entity, then you can get more information. But for now, we don't want to get the end user outside of the narration. So the text will stay in the position it is, because we want to give the possibility for the end user to continue reading at the position where he or she was. But of course, at a later stage, we maybe will provide an additional functionality so that maybe the end user can decide to move to another story that will be related to the chosen entity. So that's where we are now, where we are situated at the moment. And just in the last slide, I wanted to mention that basically this project, if you go to the next slide, basically this project belongs to a general direction that we follow, that some of the projects, at least in the lab, follow at the moment. And this is how we can combine narration with exploration in data visualization. So we want to give also the possibility, we want to give the possibility of having linear stories and passages, but always allowing at the same time an in-depth exploration of our collections. And if possible, to try to go from a state of story telling to some kind of story making. So having some change in the agency and allowing also the end user, by doing specific selections in the knowledge graphs, then create their own story, or at least move to other stories, and so they can navigate and explore better the collection. That was from my part. I will hand it over to Boris. So we'll talk more about the theoretical part of visualizations. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ilias. Yeah, just as Ilias said, I would like to close this little presentation here with a few, well, more conceptual ideas, how we treat data visualization, how we understand data visualization. You've probably seen from this kind of project, it's a very diverse bunch of topics we're working on. And we are at its core a visualization lab, and we engage a lot also with the scientific community. We have a number of papers published also in Euroviz, HCI conferences, and so on. So, and Marian is, I always say, is a kind of a proper scientist. He comes from a computer science background, while I come from a design background. And I think it's these two different perspectives that we try to really merge and bring together in the lab. Now, I think kind of one really important concept for us is to really treat data visualization as cultural images. And this is something I would like to talk about for the last minutes of this talk. And I would like to start with a quote from Ben Schneiderman. He's professor for computer science at the University of Maryland, and he's kind of a really elder statesman of data visualization. And in the book, Information Visualization by Isabelle Murray, there's this great quote from Schneiderman, which says, and I'll read it now for a minute, like Galileo's telescope, Hooke's microscope, or Röntgen's X-rays, new information analysis tools are creating visualizations of never before seen structures. Jupiter's moons, plant cells, and skeletons of living creatures were all revealed by previous technologies. Today, new network science concept and analysis tools are making isolated groups, influential participants, and community structures visible in ways never before possible. And on the one hand side, I really like this quote because it just there's a certain emphasis on knowledge discovery, that we can use data visualization to really create new insights, to create new information, new knowledge structures, and so on. So there's something very positive about this quote that I really like a lot. But I think there's also a problem with this quote, and that's the way that Schneiderman basically kind of compares data visualization to a very, very technical structure. It's a little bit, he says that data visualizations are like photography, and I think this is a great photo here. This is the first photo from the Andromeda Nebula taken in 1887. And this was indeed, back at the time, a new way to document, to explore the universe, that you could suddenly take a photo from a distant nebula. But the whole way, again, that Schneiderman describes this process is extremely technical. So what he suggests is that we can just take data, we chuck the data into some kind of program, we have some kind of algorithms in this program, and then these algorithms generate a visualization. It's a bit like, light falling through a lens into the eye or into the camera, and then automatically in this technical process, you get a new image. So the whole concept that he introduces in this quote is the concept of a technical image. And as you can imagine, I have a slight problem with that. I have a slight problem with the notion that data visualizations are technical images. And there is actually one book that's now 40 years old, by a really interesting philosopher that you probably know, by Wilhelm Flusser. In 1983, he published a book called Towards a Philosophy of Photography. And if you don't know Flusser, it's really worth it. I think it's one of the most interesting thinkers in this intersection, in this space between technology and design. I find him very, very relevant today. And in his book, Towards a Philosophy of Photography, he creates kind of a theory about technical images. And what's really interesting about that is you can basically just exchange the word photography through data visualization, and you get a really, really interesting and really relevant theory on data visualization. Because there are some parallels how he talks about photography and how we should talk and can talk about data visualization. The first thing that Flusser does in his book is he creates kind of a definition of what is actually a technical image, and it's a very, very simple definition. He just says a technical image is an image produced by an apparatus, or by apparatuses in plural. So it's very clear there's a strong link to technology, that technology is used to generate an image. And he also talks a lot about how these technical images are perceived, both in the public and by kind of scientists. Again, I think it's a really interesting quote. The technical images, appear to be on the same level of reality as their significance. What one sees on them, therefore, does not appear to be symbols that one has to decode, but symptoms of the world through which, even if indirectly, it has to be perceived. So to go back to the photo from the Andromeda Nebula, it's basically this photography is on the same level. The significance of this image is the same level as in reality. So it's a very, very naive way that we often look at photography. We just say it's kind of a little shot or from reality condensed in an image. So we often have this naive understanding of photography. Obviously, there is a problem, and I think especially a problem if we put it also in a scientific context. What Flusser also says, another quote is, he compares photography to kind of what he says traditional images like paintings or drawings. And he says with traditional images, by contrast, the symbolic character is clearly evident because in their case, human beings, for example, painters, place themselves between the images and their significance. And it's obviously, if we look at the Mona Lisa or at Rembrandt, we immediately understand that, every little dot of color had to be placed there, produced there by a painter. So it is not just reality that's depicted in these paintings, but they're really created, they were designed, they were painted. Photography seems to be a bit more objective, seems to be seem to mirror literally reality. And I really like the sentence that Flusser introduces here, which says that a human being places himself or herself between the images and their significance. So there's always a human being involved that translates this kind of view from the external world, from reality, into a painting. And this is a transformative process that he describes here. I think it's a very, very interesting way to think about image generation. And the point he makes, and I think it's kind of obvious that I'm leading to that, is Flusser says the lack of criticism of technical images is potentially dangerous. Dangerous for the reason that the objectivity of technical images is an illusion. They are, like all images, not only symbolic, but represent even more abstract complexes of symbols than traditional images. So what he's trying to say here is that, photography, but for me also for data visualizations, there are always necessarily a cultural image in the way that there are always humans involved in translating these abstract data sets into concrete images. And I'm very consciously not using now in visualization here from the UCLAB, but from The Economist, from the graphic details section of The Economist, which is a very, very respectable data journalism unit. And what you can see here is the amounts of hours that people read certain topics in the last year. And you can immediately see this is kind of, they were able to record how much time was spent on a certain news article, what kind of topics were really of high interest at what time in the year. So you really have very, very concrete numbers, and it's fairly measurable topic. And so you have these kind of abstract data sets, but they still need to be translated into an image. So even this, which seems to be a very, very, I mean, it's a great visualization. It's a great, it's also a great image, but it seems very technical, with this kind of grid, which looks a bit like a table, which has a graph attached to it. But even this kind of seemingly technical image is at its core the cultural image. And I think this is a very, very important point that we need to understand, that we need to discuss more when we talk about data visualizations. And I find it always very, very intriguing when we talk about these kind of subjects with colleagues who come from the computer science, that they're kind of not only skeptical, but they kind of dislike this notion of having, and again, I quote Flusser, of having a designer standing between an image and its meaning. They always feel that this is a kind of, it's muddled, that designers introduce new levels of complexity of meaning. As designers, we shouldn't be there, and it should be just objective data visualized in the most objective way possible. But again, I think the point really is that this is really not possible, that there are always human beings involved in creating these visualizations, that there are always human beings who have to decide how to present this data, how to visualize it, and how to make it accessible, how to communicate it to a wider audience. So in a nutshell, I think our understanding is that data visualizations are always cultural images, and they're always designed. Even if you use Excel, even if you just launch Excel and say, okay, translate these numbers into some kind of graph, there is some kind of design notion involved. It's your decision what kind of template you're using, and it was a decision of Microsoft how to come up with these templates. So again, I think kind of this is a very central assumption for our work here in Potsdam, and we really think that designers necessarily have to place themselves between the images and their significance. And I think from our point of view, it doesn't really matter if you're doing data visualization, like Fontana's Handbibliothek, or let's say kind of if you're staging an opera, or if you're designing a poster, or if you're designing a new font, or if you paint a picture or write a poem. These are all inherently cultural activities, and I think it's very, very important that we do that also for the designing of user interfaces, obviously, but also for the design of data visualizations like this. This is also a very nice current project, Fontana's Handbibliothek, the visualization of books, and famous German author Theodor Fontane. And here's a visualization of where he did some markings in the book. And this is just a speed run, basically, of the visualization, just to give you an idea of how this looks. So my point is, while this is also making information more accessible, more visible, and I think it adds information, it adds knowledge to a certain topic, it is at its core a cultural image and not only a technical one. So with that, I would like to close. Thank you very much for your attention, for the invitation, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Three very awesome topics. So let's thank the speakers. Three very awesome sort of aspects, and maybe we should sort of separately address them. I think there's a number of really interesting things going on, like what you have just outlined, that visualizations are also cultural images. At the same time, you will probably agree that they're, you know, Jacques Bertin famously said, graphics is monosemic, like math, as opposed to images and text. And Max Planck would have said, you know, all of our instruments, apparatuses, are biased by the shortcomings of how good the instrument is and how good our own instrument, meaning our sensory organs, are. So there's a kind of dichotomy, where at the same time, like even if you create a visualization as a cultural object, you nevertheless, obviously, you strive to, for example, faithfully depict the hand library of Fontane, right? So there's this you have a strive towards this monosemicity, while at the same time, you could strive to say there is an error or a bias in that thing, which is either cultural or an error. And so that is, I think, a really interesting sort of, in German, we would say Spannungsfeld, sort of a tension field where good design probably brings in both. And I think that is, you give very, very good examples, and these are not the only ones. Like all your work is sort of like, you can really see that bathing in that sort of conviction that these two things need to be mixed, and that's why they are outstanding. So that is, I think, a really, really interesting thing. So I would say we sort of rotate out the discussion. We could go one by one, or we could sort of like just talk about what comes up. So as there is no hands coming up, there is a hand. I encourage everybody else to raise their hand and ask an interesting question. For now, I go with Mila.
Yeah, thank you so much. Amazing work that you're doing in your lab. I'm really thrilled about all these different projects that you showed us. And I have actually two questions, and I'm now thinking in which order to go. But maybe I will start first with the question to Ilias, because Max also mentioned this kind of like errors in data, and how do we cope with that? And I was really intrigued by that you mentioned these like hidden layers in the data that we often have. And well, my background is in cultural history, and I also deal much of these kinds of like data coming from different cultural institutions. And it's quite interesting that I have also noticed that there are always kind of like different layers coming in the data. So it is not only like pure data, but there are certain selections, and you can see sometimes some kinds of like when you are trying to do these visualizations, you actually later on realize that what you are actually visualizing, it is not so much about the data itself, but it shows more, for instance, how diligent the people who have been adding to the metadata there, how much work they have been putting there, and so on. So it is kind of like interesting to think about these different layers in the cultural data, and kind of like what are the processes behind those things that we see in the data layers. So so I just wanted to ask that, as you showed this very like lovely project with the fashion visualizations, did you, and I think that this point that you showed that there is some kind of like conceptualizations by these curators labeling something as oriental or the other or these kinds of things. So putting their perspective to the data. So did you somehow try to visualize these kind of like hidden layers in your project, or so what is your stance on trying to, are you trying to visualize these hidden layers here as well? And maybe I because I have another question to Boris.
Maybe let's do one by one.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, okay. I would say that for now we haven't yet reached the stage where we can say we can go very deep and see the whole history of the collection and how the curators, basically it's not about the curators, it's about the creator of the collection himself, this guy who his name was Franz von Niepaheide, who gathered many of the paintings and drawings at the end of the 19th century. We know, for example, and this information comes from the curator, that there were some depictions that actually were even hypothetical depictions of fashion. Not all of these images represent real costumes. Sometimes it was also people like modeling and wearing even some peculiar clothes, and just they wanted to create a nice atmosphere just for a print of that time. This information is not always possible to identify from the beginning when you do the data gathering. Actually, you need a specialist like the curator, but she has been working with the collection for many years now, so before the project itself started. I think the way we want to go is we try to first start from the general graph. By general, I mean just, let's say, putting all of our metadata and see the whole image. And then I think this way visually, so we start from the visual part, and then we can identify some peculiar maybe relationships. This I cannot say for sure now because we're still in the process. And then starting from there, we can focus on more specific relationships and patterns, and then we'll get more deeper. And basically it's a mutual relationship between the visualization, the curator herself. So she sees the visualization, then this triggers many more questions. She will go back to the collection, she will do much more research and ask other people. And it's an iterative process. And I guess this is how it's gonna go. But we're still trying to figure out for ourselves. I cannot give yet a clear answer.
I know. Yeah, thank you. And this actually, or should I? Yeah.
Can we? I think can we maybe rotate the discussion around like the issue of Ilias and then go to Boris? So I think that it's more fruitful, if that makes sense. Do you have any more for Ilias or?
No.
Okay. So let me hook into. I see one here. Let me hook into this and ask a direct question regarding this. Direct links you draw, like on the Miro board, you showed this sort of simple mock-up sort of like interface, which is using Miro. Some of us here are using too, but the audience may not know. So basically it's like a whiteboard where you stick post-its and images and then you can draw lines. Now, one of the interesting things is that you are prototyping lines between images and text maybe. And that is sort of like a tangible, discrete relation, like you could draw in a knowledge graph. While at the same time, the whole thing awfully looks a little bit like a Memnosuni plate by Ebbe Warburg, where there is no such lines, but there is a proximity or a further distance of the image, which is obviously something where the curator would gauge with their eye. It was like, oh, okay, that looks a little bit less similar, this looks more similar, stuff like that, which obviously makes great sense with the material that you just lined out, which since the beginning of fashion, people were making up past fashion, right? The kings of Alba Longa on the Forum of Augustus with the fantasy shoes that never existed and stuff like that. So this is a really interesting thing. And so the question I have regarding this is, so you are developing these modes of depictions, but then the person who's really interested in the relationships, both the similarity, proximity, and the actual sort of lines you can draw is the curator. So I do not envy you in that kind of situation that you're actually serving a customer to whom you sort of at the same time you produce a tool they need to use, while at the same time you are producing a thought process which also needs to go on in that curator. That is a really interesting catch-22, which both in information design and in database development, we have since like ever there was a separation of labor in that kind of thing. So how do you solve that? Like, do you ideally would like to end up in a situation where the curator adopts sort of this graphical thinking as their mode of thinking? Or is that something where you say, okay, there's stuff we do and stuff they do, and there is, how do you build that bridge? I'm super curious about that.
To be honest, we can not go very deep into this kind of, let's say, thinking, just out of pragmatic reasons. It's just because it is a project which has a deadline. Sometimes we have to just put it on a very pragmatic basis, which means that as our target is basically to create a way of a new form of accessibility to the collection, and then it goes basically our most important person at the end is the user of the collection or the visitor of the museum, and then somehow it stops there. So the curator is involved in the process before the creation of the visualization. Ideally, if we would have plenty of time, yes, this visualization would go back to the curator, who would try to see more relationships, identify, then maybe comes with new thoughts, sometimes even on a very technical perspective. Sometimes by looking at these relationships, the curators come out with new concepts and terms how to describe the collection. Things that they already knew, but they hadn't thought about when they first described the collection. So always they can augment and deepen on their way of describing the collection. But because we have this timeline, let's say, at the moment, we don't really use that much of that feedback. I see that Sabine de Günther is now here. I don't know if Sabine has heard the discussion, but Sabine.
Hello.
Hey, Sabine.
Sabine is the curator, so
yes.
affect, or she left. I don't know. Yeah.
No, she's here. She's here. Maybe we should. Yeah. Should we? Hello, Sabine. We're talking about the relationship between designers and the curator, and how much at the end the curator becomes a designer or starts to employ design thinking in their own sort of like thought process, versus obviously you could turn it around and you could say how much of the domain expertise needs to sort of like rub off on the designer in this kind of relationship. So the question is like, how does that evolve over time, basically? But you don't need to add something because you just entered the room, if you don't like. So there was a question by Matthias Müller-Prove.
Hi, folks. Matthias Müller-Prove calling from Hamburg. Maybe a different twist to the discussion that we had just a minute before. I have some notes here on the left of my screen. It is something like end user, customer, accessibility, and visitor of the museum. I'd like to challenge the part of the end user I love your project. I'd like to dance in joy. Boris and Ilias, what you've done is wonderful. And the designer's heart is jumping and says, wow, this is terrific. Challenge, question, what's happening after the wow? So the moment of wow is 10 points, but is it really useful in everyday use? And for whom? And how do you design the products in interaction with people who want to, I don't know, use their hardware that is 10 years old? And do they think all this is, well, too ambitious for everyday use? And do they really understand? Is it for the curators, or what I also said, the visitors of the museum? So do you want to display the knowledge graphs of the fashion to the visitors inside the museum while they are standing next to the old skirts? Lots of questions. Your turn now.
Yeah, just to maybe address kind of your first question is the whole question regarding end user and usability, user friendliness, and so on. That's very project dependent, and I think it's important to emphasize that. And for example, the first project I've shown is the census project. We collaborated very, very closely with a number of stakeholders from finance, from politics, with NGOs, and the whole aim really of the census project was to come up with tools and with visualizations that are inherently useful to specific user groups. So there was a very, very close relationship to users. And I didn't say that because I didn't have enough time, but census is not for the general public, but it's really for a bunch of, let's say, again, translators, who people who want to use of scenario users. So the whole notion of census was to create tools that scenario users could use to do better work. Like, for example, somebody from the finances, for example, I learned that in the project, which is always a huge privilege. You always learn a lot about stuff. For example, finance is really looking into climate change. It's one of the big indicators also for financial projections for the next 20, 30 years. And so they really want to make sure that they invest their money right. And so they really want to understand how climate change will affect their investments. So they're really interested about climate change scenarios, and they kind of already know how to use them, which is a completely different aspect, but they were great. For example, the finance guys were probably the best user groups we had, because they're really very keen. But also we collaborated with NGOs from Nigeria and from the Netherlands, and it was there more about kind of climate impacts. And then they wanted to communicate to people in the Netherlands, you know, what happens if this and that happens in these scenarios. So again, then we have very, very specific user groups, and we collaborated very closely with them. The exact opposite is coins. Coins is just an exploration, and coins is just really, and I think this is absolutely legitimate. And I sometimes feel that this gets sometimes lost in these in the design process. It's just more a formal exploration, what you could do with the data, with the material, and how you could just really, and again, it's like staging an opera, how you can inscenere, there's not a great English word for it, how you could really stage this kind of opera in terms of making a great visual impact and just having a fun tool to play around with. It has no intention. It doesn't, you know, it has not didactic use, but it's much more playful. And so I think these are two different projects from two different sides of a gradient when it comes to really user-centeredness. So I think that's a very important point to say. Really, it depends on the project. It really depends on the project what you want to achieve.
I'd like to propose to add sound to the coins project, that you can do klimper with coins.
Dagobert Duck. That is
exactly.
nice. Yes.
With adding some clang, nice. Mila, you had raised your hand, and now we switched fluidly to Boris, so maybe you want to go on with that.
Well, actually, I think that my second question was answered already. So
okay.
I don't know if it makes sense to continue on that. So yeah.
Okay. As there's no hands raised, I have like sort of 3 points which are sort of like a triad, which are quite, I think would make sense to discuss. So let's start with the coins thing. So I happen to be an art historian and have too much exposure to knowledge graphs as a database consultant. And coins are a very interesting genre because you said at some point casually, you can show all the properties of the coins, but these are the properties which sort of you get for free from the inventory database, but are exactly not the properties that a coin specialist would be interested in, which is all the differences in the haircuts of Julius Caesar, or like, you know, sort of turns of noses, or like what's around his head, what's in the recto and the verses of the coin, how much stuff has been filed off the coin. It's like more filed off of Julius Caesar's than from Commodus's and stuff like that. So there, it's also like not a purely qualitative, but there is this sort of like quality in quantity kind of thing, which characterizes this genre. And there, I think the critique or sort of like point Matthias just made comes in, which is quite interesting, is there is a whole user group that is not the target of your visualization. But then the question is, how can they be roped in and looped in? Like, which in this particular case, I think would be a really cool sort of use case, because that is a very privileged field of study. Like there is some people who achieve their PhD in it, and then they're allowed to open all the drawers and touch everything by hand, which you can obviously not allow hundreds of people for obvious reasons to do, but with your interface, you can totally do that, which I find quite interesting. And so that is a sort of an interesting kind of story, that there is usage that is outside the scope of what you're doing that would enrich a large crowd, but for whatever reason, whatever you do, whoever you design for, you cannot design for everybody. So my key question would be, is that something you take into consideration, how versatile and long-lived is what you're actually doing? Or is it indeed, as Ilias just pointed out, you know, there's a deadline for the project and needs to do a certain thing, and it's better than the thing not happening, basically?
I think it's, again, important to make a distinction between, let's say, more applied and targeted research projects, like, for example, DEFA. You have a deadline, you know, you have to, something needs to be, or with census, you know, we had a very, very clear deadline, we have stakeholders, we have very clear aims and objectives. And with coins, that wasn't the case. And I always try to make a strong case for the right of doing design research. And design research means that I'm, as a designer, I'm interested in a certain question. And this question does not have to be, you know, an experimental setting, but more a question of expression, of arranging information, of trying kind of new design approaches for configurations and so on. So it's really more, it's more an exercise in a way, and not really a finished project that you could say, okay, this solves these questions. But I think in producing these kind of prototypes and in producing this kind of design research, we're just adding new ideas of how to visualize data in this kind of big space of possibilities. And I think it's very important that we do that, because this is also a notion that I found true, and it's understandable for many reasons. But for example, if you do a workshop with stakeholders, they already have images in their head. They already have kind of certain preconceptions, what they would like to get out of the project, which is totally understandable. But sometimes you have to challenge them and do something that they do not expect. And this is always risky. And I think it's very, very important that it creates a certain conflict. Or you do it in a kind of a separate setting. And again, kind of coins was done more in a separate setting. The museum was very, very kind of, they didn't have, you know, a clear briefing. So I think it really, really depends on the specific project configuration. Now, but your first question, I think, is also really important. And this is something that Ilias came back at the very end, that what we're trying to do right now, and I get that you're kind of a bit sick of the knowledge graph, but that we try to really bring in more, combine visualization, for example, with storytelling, and to really add more information, to provide more context. Let's say, think more about how is it read, how is it perceived, how is it consumed, what we do. But again, this is, I think, is a separate question. And I think in REFA, you're doing it very intensely right now, but in other projects we don't, which I think is totally fine. You don't always have.
Yeah, of course. There's another point regarding like the second 2 points. So one is a positive kind of thing, which I think that you're not even seeing so positive, which I found quite interesting. So Ilias said, you use the CDOC CRM, which is a conceptual reference model for cultural heritage data. It's a very complicated, not a complex data model that sort of like can blow up in front of you and like, you know, you get lost in the details and stuff like that. So one of the interesting things that you said, oh yeah, but like as we worked through the project, we added other aspects from other metadata schemas, meaning from other data models. That sounded like an excuse sentence to the evaluators of a project, which is quite interesting because the CDOC CRM is sort of in evaluation often used as a data model standard. And so basically the less informed people would like to have it sort of enforced. And sort of that, I think is I'm as guilty as everybody else. So there's any project that uses standard data model says like, yeah, but then we had to use this other thing, which sounds bad, right? But it's actually the right thing to do, because if you ask the special interest group people who developed the CRM, they would even say, you know, it's a conceptual reference model. It's not the model of the world. It's a reference model. Like if you have nothing else and you need to figure out like, how do you model your data? That's what you do. But if your data is specific, why should you even use it, right? And so I think that is there's a positive thing. So actually, I would not frame it as like, oh, now as we went along, we also had to use, but it was like, no, that is the actual achievement, that you found the structure of the data that makes more sense with the data. Difference to the CDOC CRM is a result, not a shortcoming. I think that is something which this is more a message to the digital humanities crowd, particularly the older ones who are in the position to evaluate projects like ours or like yours. That is sort of something that is normal. Actually, if the data models pan out as people at the green table have designed so in the 1990s, then none of the research would even be necessary. But then now here is another thing which has to do with this emergence. That's the third point. So there is some emergence in the data, like for example, and now this is an uncanny thing. If I look at your user interface, there's a text in the middle. Then you show an image typically. So there's very few situations where there will probably 10 images pop up in your sort of like scrolling situation. But then on the left in your knowledge graph, typically you see one node and a bunch of spaghetti pointing out of them. So that is a really interesting thing, because everybody who has some data where there's a knowledge graph in the background wants to have that node link diagram. Like case in point, my PhD has one of these figures where there is a database user interface, and then there is like one network picture. That's like 2004 or whatever. I did that picture. And so people have done this over and over and over. IBM Bluemix, for example, you know, you can browse the news of the last 3 months as a node link diagram. Famously, nobody knows it because, you know, it didn't fly. While the largest knowledge graphs that we know, Facebook, the Google Knowledge Graph, which you see when you search something on the left side, or Wikidata, very, very convincingly do not come with a node link diagram, because most of the time you would see one node, and once it's interesting, there's so much stuff going on, then you couldn't even read it. So the question is, should we say goodbye to node link diagrams of knowledge graphs beyond data modeling, because the user can't deal with it anyway, and it's a pain to design them, but they're actually not useful? Should they be replaced with a structured data sheet or something like that that looks more like, you know, the kind of structured information you have in Wikipedia on the side? And that is, these are things which obviously, once we do that long enough, we encounter them. But obviously, when you have a customer who hears knowledge graph, there's like, okay, they learn knowledge graph is a network, so they want to have a node link diagram. And their science and design mix up, where all of a sudden your Jacques Bertrand, Max Planck, and Wilhelm Flusser thing mix, where you can say, actually, you know, it's not quite just cultural. There is actually some scientific structure which you cannot debate away. Most of the time your screen is empty. Very, very little time your screen is super full, and that is a law. And you cannot get around it. And your apparatus just has to deal with it in a sort of scientific fashion. So how can we actually create a situation where these kind of thoughts can be debated. Our group is one of them. Your group is obviously one of them. But the question is, can this be more combined? Or is it for always, for all times like this, there's cultural people over there who own the data, there's design people over here, and there's quantitative people over here, and they have these sort of encounters, but then they have to give up again. So where would be the place? Where would you see the place where this kind of stuff can be negotiated? Is that something that comes up in your work? Or is it something you have to bring to the table? Or is there moments where you naturally have a discussion about node link diagrams with the curator, for example? Sorry for being very long, but this is a very tricky issue. But I think it goes to the core of certain things, right? Isn't it?
I would say, I mean, I always bring the discussion always to the pragmatics. I mean, these are things that we all think about. And anyway, what I showed you before, it's just what a prototype that is going to be further developed. We don't know if the knowledge graph will be at the end displayed the way it was now displayed with all of this information, because we also realize that this can be chaotic for the end user. So there are going to be some design decisions about maybe some entities are going to be shown, some entities not, or maybe we're going to have a limit of how many edges are connected to a node, or maybe some will be hidden, and then you have to put an extra interaction layer, and then the end user can click and get more information. These are all things that will be decided in the process. Also, maybe because now you just saw the lines connecting the entities, if we put also some labeling and showing the relationships, this also will make it more readable. Of course, it still is a huge amount of data, and it's very difficult to deal with all of this information. So I would just very briefly could say that it's something we are debating and discussing on it, although it's not on the level we are now, we're not there yet. It should be part of the general discussion in digital humanities, for sure, how digital humanities, how knowledge graphs, what role they play and how they should be used and exploited, let's say, the best way possible. I think by bringing the narration on the side, I think, but this is a very, I mean, I haven't thought very well about it, but I think that this is a help tool. It helps you go through the knowledge graph. So it's complementary, but I don't think that it's that confusing. At least that's my first reaction. But I think we're gonna find out more through the process. That's what I can say for now. I don't know if someone else wants to add something.
You refer to a thing called the process. Is that the design process?
Yeah, basically the design process. Yeah, I mean, how all of this will take this visual form, this interface, and we discuss around this basically. I would say this is the main focus. Yes, Sabine, you
but it's also a mixture of design and curation. I mean, we like design adopts according to the narration and vice versa. So the narration text is not sort of solid. It will have to be evaluated and sort of adapted to what we can actually show, and it's a guidance through, or an entry point to the collection, where I think some genres or some contents need to be described, not just through the metadata, and some connections as well between prints, drawings, paintings, and real garments. They have to be explained, and maybe the eyes have to be sort of guided a little bit, or just like, for example, my favorite genre, the caricature, to some people just needs to be explained. This is the group of caricatures, and what kind of context do they, or information do they convey? That's the kind of where the narration would jump in, because the metadata for these single objects, of course, they don't they do connect to the other items, but they don't have like a meta layer that sort of explains groups of images or groups of items. I think that's where the narration can actually guide through somehow, or provide entry points. Yeah. If that makes any sense.
Yes, I think this is a very interesting moment. There is a thing where at the same time we talk about information design, visualization, design as a graphical design process. And then there is the broader design process, which include, our people would argue curation is also a design process. There's actually one of our board members, Julio Tino, wrote a book with Bruce Mao. We have another lecture in this series, which is online on YouTube. Which basically they talk about the nexus of art, science, and technology, where they say it's a design process. And so indeed, just like you can design a system, you can design how people enter, not just the ticket and sort of how the subway plan looks like, but how people move through the subway is a design problem. And so one of the interesting things is that in your circumstance, it very much seems so that you co-create sort of a designed experience, which is partially graphic design and partially it's actually sort of the interaction of, I don't know, the visitor with your visualization, for example, or even the understanding of you as a curator and the designers of the collection. And then maybe the result of the work may be rather straightforward, just a reconfiguration of the exhibition itself. So they will never see the user interface, they will never see the knowledge graph, but the user would basically just walk in the museum, looks different, maybe better. And so that kind of thing is sort of something which I struggle a lot with for example, in general, talking about research group design. Like how do we design PhDs? How do we design co-author papers? How do we design group work? Which is exactly like that. It's one thing to design a visualization, but the other thing is like, how do we design this process where we ourselves percolate through the system as like sort of participants, but we come out as different people with a different knowledge. And I think that is sort of like something that is very beautiful in like not only the work you have shown of sort of Marian and Boris's group, but that is sort of something which you have as a sort of, you're part of a larger crowd of people who does this since sort of like a decade. And that is a really interesting thing because we need to also surface that. It's not just graphic design and not just user interface design, but there is this more general thing that even like the data preparation is a design problem. And I would be very curious if you agree on that, or if you say, okay, there's still a fundamental difference between research and, for example, design, right? Like, how do art historians see themselves in your group? Are they art historians or are they participants in the design process?
I think, the one doesn't exclude the other, I would say. I mean, Sabine can talk more for herself, but I see her as part of the design of the whole process. So the whole process is a design process. And yeah, as you said, Maximilian, I think that even being a curator, coming from the art history perspective, I think you are designing, you design experience if you create narration and stories, as Sabine does. Then she's providing a medium for our users how to navigate through the collection and how to find out the relationships between the items or get to know more about the collection. So for me, at least, this is a design process. I don't know, Sabine, how you see yourself. But...
Yeah, I would totally agree. I mean, so far it's been more on the art history side, but now that we kind of enter more the design process, I'm also part of it, even though it's mainly, at the moment, it's mainly Giacomo who kind of proposes how he would turn it into an interface. But I think this is going to be more collaborative. But I agree, it starts with the data curation or the data making. There are like 1,000 decisions you take before coming to a conclusion, and that affects the entire the entire process. So it's from the very start, actually. And to your question of how you what experience you make during the project, and I'm not sure whether one can actually describe it or illustrate it in a way, but I've been part of a design process in a previous project where we were like we had 5 different perspectives, from interface design to restoration to art history to fashion history. And it was challenging, and it certainly changed my view of the other perspectives. And in the end, it kind of merged together, and you have to take a lot of effort to actually communicate properly, or to talk about terminology. But that's a different thing. I don't know how you can actually document this kind of experience.
I think I would like to add one short thing, if I may. And it's a small anecdote I often tell, but I find it really intriguing. When the first iPhone shipped in 2007, it did not support copy-paste. You could not do copy-paste on the first iPhone. And I think this is a really, really intriguing fact. And it's intriguing because technically, it has been done. Douglas Engelbart, 1968, they already knew copy-paste. It's not a technical challenge. But they had absolutely no idea how to translate that into a user interface. They had absolutely no idea. And to be honest, the implementation today isn't great, but at least they found some kind of implementation. But I would say, for example, on a desktop PC, it's superior to small touchscreens. So, but my point is, they had to invent a way, they had to invent a new user interface for a technical standard that has been around for many, many years. So the point I'm trying to make here is that sometimes you do have to invent new designs, new user interfaces in order to make a really successful product. And I think the knowledge graphs it's a wonderful example, because if you talk to curators and to data scientists, they have already this visual idea of a knowledge graph in their mind. They come with certain preconceptions into the workshops and into the project, and they want to see their project as a knowledge graph. And I think for example, it's a great design problem because it hasn't been properly solved. We've seen a lot of knowledge graphs and they have problems. You just described them very well. And we're very much aware of the problems. Sometimes they are useful in certain contexts, but I think there is more potential in knowledge graphs than we have already discovered. So my whole point is that, because you said that at some point, do we need them? Will we have them in the future, or should we just leave them out? And I think they are still they are an interesting design challenge, and we haven't simply found the right way to visualize knowledge graphs in a way that makes them really accessible, productive, and so on and so on. So I think really it's a design challenge, and this is something we try to address and to push in this context.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm smiling because the difference is, let me be very polemic. The difference is 10 years. 10 years after I started doing knowledge graphs, I finished my PhD on reception and transmission of visual information as complex networks based on an art history knowledge graph. And so there was a bifurcation. It was a very particular moment. I walked out of a hotel lobby in Rome after a conversation with Martin Durr, that I said, okay, I don't want to do knowledge graph management. I want to be a network scientist. So there's a difference. And actually, by coincidence, just come back from a talk invitation in a workshop that was organized by Fotis Yanidis. And when we met there in Würzburg, we remembered that the first time we met was another talk invitation, which was for a workshop at Brown University exactly 10 years ago. And that workshop was data modeling in the humanities, which was about this, exactly what you're talking about, where people came up with conceptions about how these knowledge graphs should look like. And now this time, the workshop was about data analysis for the digital humanities, where about 95% of all talks were network science. So it's exactly 10 years later that people realize, okay, we have now collected all this data. It's our data doesn't behave like what we imagine. And now we need to analyze what's happening. And that is a really interesting thing because you will encounter it over and over and over again. Like obviously your analysis will be exposed to people who are still in the phase. They want to know how their data model is reenacted in that. How, how can you enter data and stuff like that? You need to have a model. You need to have an imagination that may not be in sync with your data. And I think that is a really interesting thing, that there's these two kind of sides, the synthesis and the analysis side, so to speak, of knowledge graphs. I like to go on with the people who have raised their hands, but there is one hand which is invisibly raised, which is Mark Metz right behind me. So I'm going to hand the word first over to him, then Mila, and then Matthias.
Thank you. I had more general question, but I can connect it to the concept of sort of data modeling. So I'm doing a PhD in CUDAN, but my background is semiotics. So in really text-oriented in some sense. So what you were, Boris, especially what you were talking about the visualization. So also as Mila brought out, it's similar ideas have been thought about sort of how to model the data itself. And so one thing that's I've seen that's been stressed more than you did was that kind of putting the stress in interpretation of whether the data or the visualizations, putting the stress of it on the person who interprets in the first place. So it's the skills of the people to interpret visualization in general. So this kind of brings forth the problem that we are, especially depending on the fields, we have different skills to interpret the visualizations, and I'm pretty sure well, at least in the Western world, weird countries, etc., the education so on will move towards us being better and interpreting visualizations. So question is kind of how do you see this work that you're doing being sort of lasting throughout time? So in the sense that you design something, but let's say that perhaps in even in few years of or another generation or towards it, the skills of interpreting visualization will change so much that we need to rethink how these things will be designed constantly. So how long will this be how long will one design be actually optimal? Because our skills of interpreting visualizations are changing rapidly.
It's a really good question. My personal, well, it's not a theory, but my assumption is that when we look at history of technology, there is this narrative, that there is always, like is it Moore's law? The speed of the transistors, doubles every so and so year. So there's always this kind of notion that everything is very fast, everything changes constantly, and we have to very quickly adapt to it. I have a slightly different understanding. And what I can see, if you look at the history of technology, is you always have, very, very steep kind of a radical change, but then you have a plateau that, keeps the same for a very, very long time. And it's just like I always compare that a little bit to the Boeing 747. I mean, it was the last one was just built, was just delivered. But it was, in the air for 50 years, hasn't really changed. It has changed nothing. It's a technology that changed travel massively, but at its core, it kind of kept the same. It was, the same engine. And I think the same is true for desktop computing, but also the way how we use mobile phones now. I don't think that's radically going to change. Now, data visualization is interesting because I think data visualization hasn't really reached that level of penetration, like, for example, mobile phones, that everyone is really competent in using various kinds of visualizations. So it has a lot to do with media literacy and data literacy. And I think in terms of media literacy, we're already kind of very, very high. Everyone on this planet almost has, got the numbers, I think at least half of the people on this planet have a smartphone, have a mobile phone. So they know how to use, they understand the design language of material design or iOS. They understand these kind of systems. They can very competently use them. But what I found intriguing, this is kind of why I always like to show this screenshot from Google Earth, where you can see the Fachhochschule as a 3D building, is I think the way that we think about it in terms of, we have interface design here and data visualization there, and there's this, humanities and so on. I think this kind of thinking in boxes is really not helpful. It's much more a gradient. And I think indeed that the visual language, especially with mobile phones and stuff, is going to extend, is going to shift slightly. And I think we will have more, let's say, information-rich interfaces, which are bordering on data visualization. So that will change. Now, to answer your question, I think I'm expecting, but I've been expecting that for a couple of years now, but I'm expecting at some point in the future, there will be a shift to a more information-dense data display. No, I have no idea how exactly it's going to look like. And then it will be a plateau. Then once people have learned kind of how to use it, they will kind of use it daily, and then it won't be a problem. But it hasn't been established yet. We don't have the same standards for data visualization like we have for mobile phones. And that makes it so interesting also for us as a design group. So I think right now it's really very much in a phase of really research and exploration, while other parts of digital media, for example, like mobile phones, if you want to order something from Amazon, that's pretty much standardized and people know how to use it. So I don't think it has been established, this kind of standard, but I'm really curious how it will be evolved, and I think it will evolve in the next few years.
Thank you very much. That transition moment reminds me, I was living in Dallas, Texas for 7 years. And at some point, I went to a coffee shop in a car, the next coffee shop, 24 miles. And I talked to the owner, who was Norwegian. It was like, I sort of have the feeling, like the diffuse feeling that the city of Dallas becomes a walkable city. And then he says, like, yeah, that's true. I have the same feeling. The problem is I have it since 10 years. And so the question is, if the current status quo has affordances that do not allow, because people are comfortable with reading texts, just like they're comfortable riding a car and parking it close to the coffee shop, as opposed to just walking there. And so that is sort of something which, you see what I mean?
Yeah, not even text. I mean, we've moved actually. Okay, I can take the exact opposite position. I'll do that right now and say, okay, all I've just said is complete rubbish. It's not true. Because we've already moved beyond text. And if you look at the younger generations right now, the way, for example, the user interface of TikTok, I think is really intriguing. And I find TikTok really also really difficult, also from a design point of view, because it is very trashy. You have all these kind of stickers, bad typography, you have an overlay of information, you have very minimal user interfaces. And the whole point of TikTok is, it's just video content, and you're not seeing any kind of complex information graphic. The only thing you're doing is you're swiping up and down. That's your basic interaction with this whole space. And it's not even text anymore. It's just really quick videos, not even long videos, and you don't even make choices. The only choice you make is go up and down. So what we have with the whole idea that we use data visualization to show complexity so that users or people can make, competent decisions, by seeing these kind of complex images, and they suddenly understand systems, understand structures, you could say, well, nobody wants that. People just want TikTok, that's it. So I think it's even more, to stay in your analogy, I mean, there will be even more cars, or even because, people are really comfortable in cars, they will just be self-driving, and it will be more comfortable, So I don't know where it goes, but I think as a research institution and as a research lab, we have to really see these trends, and we're not blind. We obviously see kind of how interfaces are changing, and I think we have to react to that. But I think it would be wrong to say, ooh, people, TikTok is the next big thing, we'll just do data visualization as TikTok. And so I think we need some kind of also conceptual and aesthetic integrity, and really say, okay, this is simply not something we're interested in. And I think it's also our job to explore possibilities that are suddenly not served by the market.
Thank you very much. Mila.
Yeah, we actually have a couple of questions in the Zoom chat, and I believe the first one is by Richard Palmer, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe we should take some of those questions also here.
Yes. Okay, let me cue them in. You have raised your hands for a while. So is that the thing, or do you have a question yourself? No? Okay, so Richard Palmer, are you still here? You want to speak up for yourself or?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi, sorry. I was hesitant about asking it because I feel it's probably more a problem on museum size, but I'm going to share it just in the hopes someone will give me an answer. I look after a collections website for a museum, and we all have very similar interfaces as we have all had since the 90s. And when we see beautiful digital humanities projects creating data visualizations, we're all very jealous. And we wish we could bring that into our collection site, but we can't because they have different data structures and different ways of interacting. And there is no way to go between the search browse method, switch to a data visualization, switch to a generous interface, overview of a whole collection, switch back, and move through all those different modes in the way that would be possibly a great advance on the current way we present the data. So my question is this a thing people think about, or should they just be considered standalone visualizations and the two should never meet?
So I think so. You're asking basically if the visualization should be part of the collection, or how is the status quo at the moment, how they're incorporated in the collections. At least for my understanding and from the environment I'm working within, it's what you said at the beginning. I would say, I think that it's basically a problem of infrastructure, because the research, of course, is happening in the university in this case, and the museum itself has its own structure. Sometimes the speed of change is different between the institutions. I think the biggest problem is also a matter of sustainability, because these projects, they have to stay alive. Technologies change, then you have maybe to migrate to a new technology. And usually most of the cultural institutions do not provide the technical expertise, or they don't have the people who would be able to take over a project that we just delivered to them, and then they can further develop it and incorporate it. So in most of the cases, yeah, the answer is yes. Unfortunately, they remain silos. I think there are cases, I don't know, maybe Boris can say for the Fontane archive, I don't know if it's part of their interface. So it's also a matter of politics. It's so many things that go beyond the theoretical level we're discussing right now. But very briefly, I would say, yeah, it's very hard. I would be a little pessimistic for now, unless we put into discussion the whole infrastructure of how the GLAM sector works, but this is a totally different, point of, yeah.
Yeah, but it's really, I think about what's going on right now, which I find also really intriguing, is a lot of museums and cultural collections have become this kind of funding from the EU, from the countries, to digitize their collections, to make them more accessible. And I always find it intriguing that you know, I mean, this comes from politicians, obviously, that they think just the fact that it's digital makes them accessible, and we know this is not true. I think for me, really, the next step would be, and again, I think would be a really fascinating vision. Right now, we work really on this kind of bespoke data visualization. We will make, you know, something very, very. We try to find a unique solution for a certain collection. But I think if we would reverse that and try really to figure out, kind of based also on these kind of standards for digital humanities, for describing the data models based on these standards, to really work on visualization tools that would allow you to kind of plug in any data set into. I think this is something also we talk a lot about, but this is something that you can't do just as a single institution. This is something, for example, I think would be a great call from the EU, you know, for funding, to just say, okay, we define some standards, and then we try to really see if we can really take very, very diverse sets of data from diverse sources, but use the same or very similar tools for exploring them in a visual way. Absolutely fascinating. I would immediately join you tomorrow if you have a kind of project structure.
Yeah, yes, please, let's do that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to add my 50 cents to this. So one of the interesting things is that if you look at the projects you've seen, you don't see one project, but you typically see two minimum. Like the coins project, for example, there's the design user interface exploration project, but there's another project, which is the digitization. They're like, if you look closely at these coins, they're all neatly lighted from one side. So they're reprographs of these coins. So somebody has given them an ID, taken a picture that sort of makes them comparable. That's probably a project that went on for 20, 30 years. And then there's now a huge photo collection. One of the big mistakes that happens is that there is a monopoly that also serves the desire of the institutions to data hug, as Tim Berners-Lee calls that. Like, you know, the Venice Time Machine project is an interesting one, right? So there's like one giant hierarchy of like sort of, you know, there's people who sit on top who are able to do the analysis and stuff like that. But in a truly sort of like decentralized form, these things would be decoupled. There would be a proper documentation of, say, every coin, every movie frame, every book, and then they would have IDs. So very similar to ISBN numbers, to ISSN numbers, to DOI numbers. You can actually cite something uniquely and you can reuse it in a thought process that is called research. We do this on a much less granular level with scientific literature since 1850, since sort of the scientific citation is sort of formalized, right? And obviously this goes back to the 16th century even further. But the key problem is that this kind of decoupling is sort of something that is super scary, because if as an institution, you scan all your objects, you make them available that way, you make them identifiable in that way, you sort of give up your position of sort of dominant ownership about that object, because all of a sudden you can compare it to something else. If the architectural archive of one architect publishes all the drawings and if another architect publishes all the drawings, not only do they lose sort of their sort of like, sort of primacy of interpretation, they give the opportunity to somebody who looks at 300 or 500 or 5,000 collections at the same time, who may understandably have a better idea, and is maybe a first semester student who's good at information design, of sort of like the history of architecture, and that puts sort of the hierarchy in question. And I think that is sort of something which we probably will encounter over and over again, that people talk about openness, like OpenAI, open data, open source. But if you look closely, the hierarchy will be well guarded. And it's really hard in order to analyze data, you have to have such a project where you're invited, and then certain things can be done, other things cannot be done. Like, Chair Thorpe's Office of Research, famous Twitter analysis that never saw the world because it was too revealing for Twitter. That kind of stuff is sort of something we need to live with and be aware of, and is a struggle which is as transformational as the introduction of the scientific citation and the encyclopedia entry in the 18th century. I think that is sort of something which is a really, really big struggle, because if you position yourself wrong in that system, your career will fail. If you position yourself in the right way, for example, you are the lifetime data analyst in an institution that has a lot of data, then you will have a constant stream of stuff like SMBBK, right? So obviously it's a better thing to do these kind of things in Berlin, because there's a huge institution that has access to many, many different data sets. If you're sitting somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Saarbrücken, good luck. That's not as easy to do in the same way. You will not have the same breadth of thing. But wouldn't it be great if we could, for example, analyze Berlin State Library, Deutsche Nationalbibliothek and Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in a sort of neutral manner? It would be awesome. But, will that happen? We don't know. I think that kind of thing is where your question, Richard, is super, super, super crucial, because that will make or break whoever will be sort of more interesting in the next 20 years. Cross-clam, sounds good. Matthias.
Yeah, cross-clam. I like to agree with all what has been said, and I only speak up now if you promise that I'm not the last one. Not to blame you, I blame myself. So I'm an interaction designer and computer scientist. And I'm deeply pessimistic and stunned about how less has happened the recent 30 or even 40, 50 years. I have a link in the chat going back 30 years. Hello, let's celebrate. To Xerox PARC, the information visualizer with the cone trees. And I, as an interaction designer, see a direct link between knowledge graphs and what has been evaluated and prototyped then already. But I'm afraid no engineer, no coder, no hacker is even aware of these systems. So how do we learn from our design history past? I don't want to be the last one, so I shut my mouth.
Should we introduce some hope in the discussion? The Economist once called
I mean, I can do that. I mean, well, I totally agree with it. And this is something that I also find really, that I'm really annoyed with, and I think annoyed is the right term here, that in the design in general is not very good with the kind of creating kind of a historical understanding of its own discipline. You know, design is always, and I mean, this is kind of understandable, but it's very, very narrow, just focus on the now and everything, you know. For example, if you're teaching design, especially interaction design, you don't really look at, you know, old masters, because I mean, it's a fairly new discipline, but there are indeed old masters. There are really intriguing designs from 20, 30, 40 years ago that we need to discuss and keep in mind. And I think it's very difficult to establish this notion of design history and interaction design history, and also to ask ourselves what we can learn from history. And the second thing is it's also what I mentioned before, that we do have these plateaus, and just the way that macOS and then later on Windows 95 just defined the way desktop systems work until today. This shows that once, you know, you have a very commercially successful standard, it's very, very difficult to deviate from it and to come up with something new. And then suddenly the iPhone came, and the iPhone was also more, even a more simplified version. I read the great quote from Alan Kay the other day, where he described object-oriented, not programming, but object-oriented interaction. So the whole notion, the desktop metaphor. How does the desktop metaphor work? And Alan Kay, who was a researcher at Xerox PARC and who was one of the co-inventors of the desktop metaphor, he came up with this great quote, and he said the object-oriented interaction is object first, desire second. So I first identify an object on screen, like, you know, like an icon, and then I have a desire what to do with it. So it's first I identify an object, and then I decide on an action. And I think what, for example, the iPhone did is it just deleted the object. It's desire first and nothing second. And I think it's a very interesting way to think about user interfaces from that perspective. And I kind of miss a more theoretical discussion about kind of the way we interact with digital media. At the same time, I'm quite optimistic that there will be new impulse coming out. There will also, the way how we use technology will change. And I think what really intrigues me about data visualization is because it's not standardized yet, you know, it's a great playground. You can just try things out and you can explore different directions. And I think it's a very, very intriguing area for creative work. So I'm quite happy actually that there are no full standards yet. I'm pretty sure there will be in 10 or 15 years, and then we will complain about them. But right now, as long as they're not established, I think it's just great to explore new ideas and to come up with new visual standards.
Yeah, we still have work to do.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to add more hope even. So The Economist called this famous Xerox PARC book by Schneiderman, McKinley, but this node tree paper is also in the sacred text of the field of information design. This is like sort of 15 years ago. And that's obviously still true. So people are aware of these kind of things. I think it's at the same time soothing. That's the same linear algebra, the same sort of geometry, the same kind of data science, the same, sort of topology that drives sort of like network science. is still true all the way since, you know, the 19th century. You could theoretically just read books from the 19th century and be a really good information designer. Obviously minus the bias in some ways. But one of the interesting things is that every day at the same time, really new things are happening. And so I'm fascinated by seeing what comes out of the group, by seeing what comes out of the community in the area we're operating, but also, you know, like just Open Science Magazine or Nature. It's not just the content, it's the way people draw figures is absolutely new. There is still new user interface innovations which make our life easier. And yes, you know, every field has their Stanley Wasserman who says like, oh, we've done this in the 80s or we've done this in the 60s. That's true. But Stanley Wasserman hasn't done social network analysis with 270,000 million or 770,000 or 273 million people. And still, you know, Milgram's 5 degrees of separation, 6 degrees of separation holds. So there is long-term stuff. So it makes sense to know the old stuff, but it's also making sense too hard to sort of value what is new. And there is so much happening in information design. I find it quite fascinating how simple things are, which took 3 days just to calculate the layout even 15 years ago. And now it's like this, like in 2 seconds, and you can retry it in different ways. And that I think is sort of something which is really the cool story in a still exponentially growing human population where there's so many new people that have so many new ideas. There is still a lot of stuff to do. And I think that kind of enthusiasm that we can bring to the table, that there is a chance to do something really new, that there won't be a standard. Yes, you know, you can play the violin according to spec, but you can still play Vivaldi's Four Seasons and do it in a new way. That is cool. And I think that will never go away. So I'm not as pessimistic. Whenever there is some standard that is enforced, you know, we will complain. And, you know, it won't hold up forever because you cannot totalitarian way sort of like force people to look at a map in a particular way. You can do so maybe for 40 years. But, you know, at some point people say, no, that's not gonna work. Let's look at reality. You cannot run Iran on Plato's state as a constitution, and you can probably not run information design on a small subset of principles which are just too restricted relative to how the world really looks. I thank all of you very, very much. The Open Lab Seminar of CUDAN will return, and in particular, it will return at a very weird time. So let me look up the exact time when this will happen. So we will have a very special lab encounter. Like all lab encounters, very special, but this also is very special. Alexander, Sandy Pentland, Esteban Mora of MIT Media Lab, the Human Dynamics group, will meet us for only 1 hour. So this will be very intense from 8 p.m. to 2100 next week on Tuesday, March 21. That's like due to a scheduling issue of both sides. That will have a different format. So there will be very, very brief introductions from our side and from the MIT Media Lab side. And then there will be a discussion which will revolve around sort of, can we quantify culture, yes or no? So with that, thank you very much, Boris and Ilias. All the people have contributed to the discussion, all the audience. This was super exciting. And I, of course, encourage every single body in this audience here and later online on YouTube to check out the work of the group and the whole design department at FH Potsdam, because that's definitely one of the most awesome places in that area. Certainly Germany, mostly Europe, and all around the world. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.